Hello, welcome back to NPTEL, the National Program on Technology Enhanced Learning. These are a series of lectures under the general topic English language and literature. We have 4 modules, as you are aware by now, on various aspects of English language and literature. The current module, that is module 4, is one devoted to various branches of literary criticism. You have already been through a couple of literary criticism or literary criticism approaches, namely classical criticism, liberal humanism, Marxism, feminism, etc. Today, we are in an important school of thought. This is not to say that the other schools are not important. However, why I say that this is important is because it was the beginning of a landmark, so to speak, or a watershed, really not a landmark, a watershed in the practices, in the way people practice literary criticism, and this school of thought is known as structuralist criticism, following which we have the post-structuralist school that we will be talking about after this, right. So, what I am going to do in this lecture is first give you, or tell you about the important tenets of structuralism in general, right. Structuralism is not something that you apply or that is applicable only to the domain of literary criticism, right. So, we first talk about structuralism as it came to us through linguistics. Then I shall talk about what structuralist literary criticism is, and in the end I shall be looking at how a poem, namely William Blake's famous poem London, may be analyzed using structuralist critical tools. Okay? So, well then let us begin to talk about what which book we shall be referring to. There are of course so many books available today, right, as far as literary criticism is concerned, where structuralism and post-structuralism are always featured, right. However, for the purposes of this lecture, you may look at a very useful book, a beginner's book really, and it is entitled Beginning Theory, right, an introduction to literary and cultural theory by Peter Berry. There are also several other books that look only at structuralism and post-structuralism that those of you who are at higher levels may want to look at. For instance, books like Structuralism and Since, then Jonathan Culler's The Pursuit of Signs, okay, also Structuralist Poetics. So, there are several titles that you may go on to look at, but from my experience, as somebody teaching structuralism, I have found that students who do not know the basics of structuralism, okay, go on to say that they find structuralist analysis very difficult, okay, after which post-structuralist and in particular deconstructionist approaches to a text becomes all the more difficult. Okay. Well, it is not just students who say that, there are several teachers who also do not like to sort of dabble in structuralist and post-structuralist theories. My suspicion is, and I may be totally wrong, but well, let me say for myself, this has helped me a lot in the sense that once you know the basics of structuralism, it becomes rather easy really to go on and read a few more quote unquote difficult texts, right. So, let us then ask you to read Peter Berry. Now, as with many other lectures, what I shall be doing is every now and then I shall be looking at or reading out certain extracts from Peter Barry's text in order, and then I shall be, like I do in the classroom, okay, sort of expounding on those or explaining those to you. Okay. So, when we looked at liberal humanism, right, when you heard, when you listened to Professor Krishna Borua's lecture on liberal humanism, you came to understand that liberal humanism talks about, the attitude to good. If you look at this slide here, attitude to good literature, which transcends the limitations of age. Okay. So, there are what we call the age old, okay, literary works that are always valuable, whether whether thematically or stylistically or to do with narrative or poetic style, right. They transcend, they overcome the limitations of space and time, and they are always the timeless classics. Okay. Next, we also saw that in let us call it conventional criticism. In conventional critical practice, we look at the social, the political, the autobiographical, the literary historical, okay, to bring up in a bit to look at the text in a bit to understand or throw light upon various aspects of the text. Okay. And another way also of studying the text is the new critical way of studying the text, which is understanding the text and studying it in isolation. Okay. As perhaps it was Arnold, if I am not mistaken, to see the object as in itself it really is, right, or what we call the autotelic text. Okay. So, today we shall find that structuralism is different in the sense that not simply because it comes from linguistics, but also that it has some radical pronouncements to make as far as language, and then following that the literary text is concerned. Okay. Then we also saw under liberal humanism, or again in conventional criticism, the literary text being celebrated because it enhances, it enhances life and propagates human values, okay, or the moral school of criticism. It is also, the literary text is usually, and also by everyone who reads the text, okay, valued for its capacity for empathy and compassion, right. So, moral values, the the characteristics, the literary characteristics of the text, right, as a new criticism, the humanist aspects as well as the humanitarian aspects of the text. Okay. All these are critical schools, critical approaches that are taught in every institution, even from the school level, right. Next, we are now turning to the structuralist school, and let me quickly read from this is actually Chris Barker, who says that a structuralist understanding of culture is concerned with the system of relations of an underlying structure, usually language, and the grammar that makes meaning possible. Okay? A literary text fundamentally is about meaning. Okay, you may talk about the style, you may talk about its historical moorings, etc., but the reader looks for meaning in a text, or the reader looks for the meaning of a text, okay, say a poem, right. So, as we move through this lecture, you will understand that a text now is going to be looked at or is going to be analyzed not for the moral message it gives us, okay, or not solely for it, nor also for its stylistic aspects, right, and that is the text in itself, but there is something very different going in here. Okay, we are looking at how meaning emanates, the possibility, okay, of meaning, or how meaning is possible in a text. For that we have several terms that we will need to learn. Okay. Again, as I said, if you are not afraid most of you are engineering students here, because this course is actually has been designed for students at IITs and other engineering institutions, right. So, if you are not scared of learning those difficult terminology in your sciences, in your physics or chemistry and biology, for instance, and in your engineering, then you should not also shy away from learning terms here, right. So, then what did we find? That the structuralist, according to critic Chris Barker, a structuralist understanding of culture and of cultural artifacts and of cultural objects like a literary text, for instance, okay, is like understood in terms of a certain system, okay, in terms of a certain system within which there are relations among units from which meaning emanates. Okay. So, we will unpack this, and we shall really easily understand what this means, okay, in terms of an underlying structure, hence structuralism, right. The text now, the literary text, a poem for instance, is going to be now looked at in terms not what the individual words kind of mean, or only the resonances of the individual word per se, but we are going to see this in terms the text in terms of a structure, right. And this structure or underlying grammar of a text is what makes meaning possible, right. So, we are going to look at the text as what? The text as a system. Okay. So, the text here, a literary text, is a system, or is seen in structuralism as a system of relations. Fine. Now, the study of the sign, right, the study of the sign, more about this just a while later. The study of the sign, which is known as semiotics or semiology, is part and parcel of understanding a literary text, okay, from the point of view or from the critical approach known as structuralism, right. So, when we talk about a literary text from a from a structuralist perspective, we are also bringing in the sign, which is, so to speak, the building block, okay, of both the text and of structuralism in general. Now, philosophically speaking, if you ask about the philosophical orientation of structuralism, the mind, the human mind, is seen as a structuring mechanism. Okay. We have certain cognitive abilities, right, and the mind gathers, or let us say responds to external stimuli, to data that are coming in, right. How does the mind, let us ask a question like this, how does the mind make sense, okay, how does the human mind make sense of data that are, the plethora of data, okay, that it is, if I may use the word, bombarded with all the time. So, the structuralists say, or structuralist philosophy, if you will, say that the mind is a set of structuring mechanisms, okay, through which it makes, or with the help of which it makes sense of incoming data. These structure, the mind therefore, through the structuring mechanisms, follows rules to make, as I said, sense of the world, okay, the sense of the world or the external world, mind, the world outside of its being, and it uses these structuring mechanisms, these cognitive structuring mechanisms, okay, to make sense of the world. Now, we are coming in this slide to a very important formulation given by the Swiss linguist, and you have heard of him, Ferdinand de Saussure. Okay. This is, let us say we are talking about the beginning of the 20th century, the first decade of the 20th century. So, Saussure's famous work, which actually was published by his students and teachers, okay, who collected his classroom lectures and who compiled these into the course in general linguistics. Saussure made a very important theoretical formulation, and that is, if you look at this slide, that a word, okay, in language, a word is a sign, right. Now, again he does not mean here the reverse, that a sign is a word. Signs are things that signify something to us, that stand for something for us. Okay. So, signs are not only words, remember, signs can also be images, obviously it can be auditory, it can be sounds, it can be visual, it can also be odor or smell, right. So, something that tells us something that signifies, and come to that later, signifies something. Okay. So, Saussure said that a word too is a sign, and importantly, please look at this slide, he split the sign into two component parts, right. The sign is comprised of A, the signifier, and B, the signified. Now, as I said, remember in the beginning, we have to know the basics, we have to grasp the basics, and this is where it all begins, right. So, what did we find? We found that a word is a sign, and according to Saussure's formulation, a sign is, it comprises two parts, A, the signifier, and B, the signified. For instance, let us, it is a very common example that is used by every teacher almost, I would say, right. So, let us say the word tree, right, is a sign, isn't it? If a word is a sign, the word tree is a sign comprising 4 letters, T, R, E, E, right. So, this tree has one part which is the sound image. Say I utter the word tree, right, and the other person can hear me saying the word tree. When we say tree, it signifies, or it in our minds we have what Saussure actually called, not, he did not really call it a concept, he called it a psychological impression, okay, a psychological impression, or what we today call the concept. So, remember the tree, the word here we are referring to is a sign, tree is a sign, and tree comprises signifier, which is the moment I say tree, or even it is not just a sound image, it is also the written image, for instance TREE written here on this tablet, right. And immediately the psychological impression we have is what is signified by TREE, that is the idea of a tree, not a specific tree, but a psychological impression of tree, right. Now, if you look at this slide, this whole process is known as the process of signification, right. So, you recall now what is the study of the sign known as? The study of signs is known as semiology or semiotics. Okay. The signs can take different forms, that is images, visual images, auditory auditory images, odor or smell, and the written, right. So, anything that stands for something or signifies something. We saw here again, let me recapitulate. We saw that we can take an example, for instance tree, and we, as Saussure has said, the tree is a sign comprising two parts, a signifier tree, and the signified, that is our concept or psychological impression of tree. Okay. Now, the very important formulation that is given by Saussure is this, that the connection between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, right. The connection is what does it mean to say arbitrary? That is, there is nothing tree-ish, okay. There is nothing tree-ish, about a tree that tells us please call me tree, right. Now, of course, there is evidence for it. How? The evidence is that a tree is referred to in different languages by different words. Now, if there was something tree-ish about a tree that asked you or asked us to call it a tree and by no other name, then the relationship between the signifier and signified would have been a non-arbitrary one. Okay? That is, if you look at this slide, there would have been a one-to-one correspondence between the signifier, tree, and the psychological impression that we have. That is, there would have been, let us use another, or a proper word, there would have been an essential or ontological relationship between the signifier and the signified. But Saussure says that, for instance, if I am sitting on a chair, the signifier chair, okay, gives us or gives rise to, in our minds, to a psychological impression or concept of chair. Okay. But there is nothing chairish about this chair that I am sitting on that would tell people that or impel people to call it a chair, right. So, the sound or the even the letters, for instance, CHAIR have nothing to do with this physical chair. Okay. So, this was a very important, as I said, it was a landmark theoretical formulation to be made. Now, again let me say, it's not that it's not that the Greek philosophers like Plato or Aristotle didn't talk about it, but Saussure was in a juncture in linguistic studies where when he found himself in a scenario where the study of or where linguistics was largely diachronic in nature. Diachronic, let us look at this word. Diachronic in nature, that is, it was over time, right. He brought in what we call the synchronic. Chrono is time, right. He brought in the synchronic approach, that is, look at language as a system, okay. Look at how language works, not simply at how language changes, not simply at historical linguistics or the diachronic or the change of language. Language systems and languages over time. Okay. He wanted to conduct a structuralist, okay. He wanted to give us structuralist formulations on language and to show how the language system works. It's almost like looking at what this language system is in almost in a laboratory sort of way, fixing it and trying to look at its component parts or how it works. Okay. So, this is an important change in the overall orientation of studies of language. So, we found that the relation between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary. Again, what does it mean to say arbitrary? That there is no ontological or there is no one-to-one correspondence between the signifier and the signified. Now, what does this mean then? This means that we enter the language system. Okay? We as speakers of a language have to surrender ourselves to the language system, and this language system is a system of conventions. Okay, conventions in the sense that we have to agree to call a chair. Imagine a situation in which in the English language there were hundreds of words, okay, to signify tree, or there are hundreds, thousands of words to signify a chair. Okay. What happens in that sense? In such a scenario, okay, there would be linguistic chaos, right, and we would never be understood. Even if you said that according to context we may have different we may have different words, okay, for tree, it is quite the other way around really, right, because if you talk about chair, you talk about a natural chair here, you also talk about the chair in the sense of a chairperson. Do you follow? Okay. So, it is important to realize how important Saussure's contribution is, and we shall see in a while how this could be applied to the literary text. Therefore, we may also say here that meaning is a combination of a sound image or also a written image and a concept. Okay. This is the association, right, the association of the sound image with a concept, and that is how meaning arises in language according to Saussure. Therefore, a text, right. Now, again I am not saying this is only a literary text, okay. Text could be any text for that matter. A text is seen by the structuralist critic following following structuralist philosophy and following structuralist linguistics, that he or she sees the text as a structured system. Okay? Not, remember now, not largely or solely a text as a system giving us or a text as an entity that gives us a moral message, or something that is very beautifully constructed with the use of proper language and use of all the characteristics that we talk about when we talk about conventional literary criticism. So, the text is a structured system here. Okay? It is a system of signifying practices. There are signs in the text, okay? And the entire text is seen as a convention, right? A convention in both reading and writing of signifying practices. Why? Because the words there are signs, right? And those signs signify something. The signifier is supposed to signify something. Okay? They are also, the text is also seen in terms of units and rules, as we shall see later. It is also seen, very importantly, though many may say in a reductionist way, very importantly in terms of a core structure which is known as binary oppositions. Please look here at the slide, known as binary opposites. For instance, nature and culture are binary opposites. Okay? Light and dark are binary opposites. In culture, male and female, okay? Good and evil, strong and weak, right? So, a text can then be searched, we could search a text for its one of its core structuralist moorings, so to speak, okay? That is its binary opposite, on which the text is sort of pivoted, or on which the text stands, right. So, meaning, therefore, if you ask where does meaning in a text come from, meaning comes from underlying structures, and as we saw here, one of the underlying structures here is what? Is a core binary opposition, or a couple of binary oppositions on which, so to speak, the text is pivoted, right. This way of thinking, or this way of doing literary criticism, this kind of let's say philosophical approach or orientation, it's important for us to know, is known as an anti-humanist approach. Okay. Remember, anti-humanist is not anti-humanitarian. There is a difference. Humanism is a school of thought. Okay. It is a phase in the history of ideas. It is a philosophy that sees the human, okay, as the center of all reference. This is very important. Okay. The human being is at the center of all reference. Okay. In terms of Freud, for instance, the ego, right, the individual ego, or even the collective ego, really, the ego is paramount here. Okay, and everything is understood as constructed by human beings, everything is understood as coming from the ego. Okay. But the structuralist enterprise is one which is anti-humanist, or which lays more importance, much more importance really, on structures in the system than on the human ego. Do you understand? Okay. So, it has nothing to do with not being humanitarian, okay, but simply put, the human now, the human ego is out of the picture. Now, the structure is paramount in understanding reality, in understanding the literary text, etc. So, if we extend this to any aspect of culture, any cultural artifact, be it text, be it music, be it dance, okay, be it any institution and its arrangements, for instance, we then see the sign as part of a whole system of units and rules, right, through which only, this is important, or only through which we may understand cultural phenomena. This kind of formulation leads us to an important anthropologist. I am sure many of you have heard his name, Claude Lévi-Strauss, okay, who is famous for his work with the structuralist approach to anthropology, okay, known as structuralist anthropology, okay, where he also studied, where he studied societies and communities using the structuralist approach, okay, in terms of binary, core binary oppositions or opposites, okay, in terms of units and rules, in almost certain schemas, many would say even formulae, okay, by which you understand a culture. So, therefore, what are the structures in question, and this is given to us by Peter Barry. The structures in question are those imposed by our way of perceiving the world and organizing experience. This is the point we talked about, in the beginning, really, how the mind is a structuring mechanism, okay, and perceives an otherwise chaotic world and its data, its enormous data by means of structuring mechanisms, right. Therefore, meaning, this is extremely important, meaning is outside things rather than inside things, okay, meaning lies outside. Now, another linguist, Roman Jakobson, okay, he talked about, remember we talked about the tree, and he talked about the very basic unit as being phonemes, okay, the letters T, R, E, E, okay. He went even beyond the sign. Remember this, the word is a sign. He goes beyond the sign and talks about its its formative units as the phonemes or these letters, okay. Now, in structuralist anthropology, the structuralist anthropologist, or like say Claude Lévi-Strauss, talks about, borrows this idea, or talks about, or rather talks in a similar way by talking about this core formative myths. These are not myths, even less than that, okay, that is at an infra level, which is the mytheme, okay. See, phoneme and mytheme. So, mythemes are the formative units of a culture, and archetypes have different meanings in different structures. Now, the important point here is many feel that structuralism is so scientific, both in anthropology, in literature, in culture, in language or linguistics, that it doesn't allow for any difference. This is certainly not so, okay. We know that the word tree, okay, means both an actual organic tree, and it can also refer to a tree diagram, okay, that you are doing, say, in your computer sciences. It can refer to a tree diagram. It can also refer to a family tree, right. It can also refer to what we call in evolution the tree of life, okay. So, it's not, structuralism does not say, structuralists have never sort of claimed that they are not looking at diversity in meaning. This is an important part. Variation of meaning in cultures is an extremely important part of structuralism, okay. That meaning, the relationship between the signifier and the signified is arbitrary, and that it may also, according to context, give rise to different meanings. So, therefore, as you see in the slide here, meaning is relational and meaning is culturally determined. So, let us again look at this slide. For instance, the myth of Oedipus, you are aware of the text, very important text, Oedipus Rex by Sophocles, okay. Now, Claude Lévi-Strauss's approach in structuralism is, for instance, the Oedipus myth, and this is given to us by Peter Barry. In the Oedipus myth, the cycle of tales connected with the city of Thebes, for instance, the story and the cycle of tales are connected with basic oppositions, binary oppositions again here, like animal and human, relation or a person who is your relative, and a stranger, husband and son. Now, you can read, taking the cue from Oedipus, you can read any text in terms of its core binary or core basic binary oppositions, okay. And these are going to take different forms, different contexts, okay, in as texts move in time and in space. Okay. But the important thing is to understand, even though there are cultural variations, the structuralists have identified, okay, these core structures, right, that are there in every culture and also in every text. So, let me read, as I said, I would read from Peter Berry from at times, and he says that the typical structuralist process is moving from the particular to the general. This is very important. Okay. Placing the individual work within a wider structural context. The wider structure might also be found in the whole, the corpus of an author's work, or in the genre conventions of writing about that particular topic, or in the identification of sets of underlying fundamental dyads. Okay? This is a dyadic structure of the binary opposition. Then he goes on to say, a signifying system in this sense is a very wide concept. It means any organized and structured set of signs, okay? Any organized and structured set of signs which carries cultural meanings. Included in this category would be such diverse phenomena as, say, works of literature, tribal rituals, fashions, the styling of cars, or the contents of advertisements. This is important for us to understand. Even a literary critic like Peter Berry, says that the structuralist interpretive or sorry, interpretative method, okay, is one that is not simply not simply to do only with linguistics or with the literary text. For instance, there are rituals that we may analyze in terms of structures, okay, underlying structures. There are advertisements, there are fashions, there are styles of anything from cars to music, as I said earlier, to anything that may be seen in terms of what he calls here underlying fundamental dyads. Now, just have some water. কিমান সময় আছে টাইম কিমান আছে 10 minutes only 10 Fine. We still have the poem to look at. So, I will quickly talk about what another structuralist critic Rolla Barthes. Rolla Barthes really had two phases to his work. It is held that the early phase was a structuralist phase and the later phase being a post-structuralist one. He had this important contribution to make. He said that when we talk about signification, we need to talk about signification at two levels. Let us look at this slide. One is the denotative level, the level of denotation, and the other is the connotative level, which is the level, the level of connotation, right. The denotative level or the level of denotation is one that is descriptive and literal. Okay, you are not looking at symbolic meanings here. For instance, if you say a tree, you are simply looking, you simply understood it in the literal sense of being a tree. And then he said that, however, there is another level of signification which is that of connotation, right. And he said that connotation is associative. This is associative in the sense, for instance, this may be a little unfortunate here, I am just bringing it as it has been given by the critic, is when we talk, say, the word pig, for instance, at the denotative level, we are the descriptive literal sense, we understand the pig as an animal, okay. But at the connotative level, it may connote something else, something other than the animal. For instance, pig may refer to a male chauvinist. Now, again, sorry for this example, or many say, it's your room is like a pigsty, for instance, okay, or he's a, or she's a, so there are levels at which we understand. One is at the descriptive level and the other is at the associative level, the level of association. This was given to us by Roland Barthes, right. Therefore, myths, or both in society, in cultures and in literature, therefore, are always connotative. They connote, or they are what he calls second order signs, right. So, we are also to understand, find out the connotative meaning in our understanding of the text, not just its literary meaning. Most of the pleasure in the text, really, I would say, or we may safely say, comes from the level of connotation, not simply at a descriptive level. It enables a very rich understanding of the text. Okay. This connotative level, again, is not that all of us are going to find the same connotations, right. Depending on reader communities, depending on individual differences, depending on cultural differences, the connotations may be different. Okay. There is, as post-structuralists would say, right, the privilege of the reader to read it, unless of course one is making no sense, or in a nonsensical way one is reading it. However, there is the privilege of the reader to bring in a different connotative interpretation to the text. Okay. So, let us now, before time runs out, what we are going to do is, I am going to look at the text in question, right. Now, the text is a well known one. It is a poem entitled London by the English poet William Blake. Now, if you look here, I am going to give you a link, because of copyright reasons, I am not really showing this to you in a slide. This is the link. Well, so let me read the poem out to you, and as I said earlier, for copyright reasons, I am not reproducing this here in the slides. You may follow the link, read the poem, and then come back to my lecture. Okay. So, this is London by William Blake. I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles I hear. How the chimney sweepers cry, every blackening church appalls, and the hapless soldier's sigh runs in blood down palace walls. But most through midnight streets I hear how the youthful harlot's curse blasts the newborn infant's tear and blights with plagues the marriage hearse. Okay. Please read this poem over and over several times. And one of the first things that we may say about this poem is an obvious one, which is this poem is a poem of social protest. Okay. Right. It is a poem that talks about exploitation, right, and we shall see how it is, again, as I said earlier, a text that could be read, of course, in several ways, no doubt about it, but it is a text that could also, or it lends itself quite easily to a reading from a structuralist perspective, focusing on the binary opposites. Okay. Remember what were these binary opposites that we had talked about a while ago? Okay. For instance, nature slash culture, okay. Human slash animal, male slash female, okay, which light slash dark. These are opposites, right. In culture, we understand these things as opposites, though they may not really be opposites, but the mind structures these things as opposites, right. So, what are then the opposites, binary opposites inhering in this poem London? Okay. Let us look at the first stanza here. I wander through each chartered street. Now, I wander through each chartered street. When we do a structuralist analysis, we are going to find binary opposites in the first line itself. This is tremendously interesting. Okay? I wander. Now, look, Blake is not using the word walked. He could have easily used the word walked. I walked through each chartered street. It makes perfect sense. Okay? But he is using a word wander. Now, to wander, again, what is in both the literal sense and also in the connotative sense. Okay? Wander here means to walk about all right, but more in the sense of roaming around. Fine. So, wander brings carries the connotations. Okay. In the literal sense, we can say yes. Also means wander means to roam about, almost in a sense of aimlessly. Right. What is the difference between walking and wandering? Right. When you walk, it doesn't necessarily mean that you are walking or about, or you are roaming around aimlessly. You have another word for it, wander. So, this here means wander, roam around, okay, almost aimlessly, which suggests you have the time, right? You have the time and the freedom to do so. Fine. Look at the word chartered, C-H-A-R-T-R-E-D. Chartered, the street is chartered, the poet, the persona is not. Okay? Chartered in the sense of hired. For instance, we talk about chartered flights, for instance, okay, which are only meant for a particular person or a group of persons, right? Hired, chartered in the sense of hired, chartered also in the sense of having a license, okay, which is again to do with government rules. Do you follow? Okay. So, I wander through each chartered street. Now, the two opposites that we may glean from here are these two, wandering and being chartered, right. Now, I wander through each chartered street, near where the chartered Thames does flow, and mark in every face I meet marks of weakness, marks of woe. In every cry of every man, in every infant's cry of fear, in every voice, in every band, the mind-forged manacles are here. Now, compared to this, person, the persona, right, who is walking the streets of London, who notices, right, the marks of sadness, the marks of woe, who notices the chartered Thames, the river full of, once free flowing river, now full of commercial, vehicles, for instance, for maybe ships or boats there, okay, engaged in commercial transactions. The chartered streets, right, the streets are also chartered in the sense that giving us at the connotative level, right, giving us a sense of something that is not free. So, one of the first things that we may talk about here, we build tentative binary opposition between the freedom of the poetic persona who registers these things and the restraint, right, the restraint or the constraints, let us say, of not just things in his surroundings like the river Thames or the streets of London, but also the people who are constrained by woe, who are constrained by sorrow. Do you follow? Okay, so this is how, even if you are not deliberately doing this exercise, the mind will, as you read the poem, also be trying to make sense of it, not simply by the moral message, or this is a poem of exploitation, or there are, he's talking about, he's talking about sorrow and weakness in London, okay, at a particular time, given time, okay. The mind is also, excuse me, subconsciously, if you will, okay, trying to, push things into either side of the two binary oppositions, okay. Then let us read on. After a generalized statement where everything is, every person, every phase talks about sorrow, every phase talks about, there is infant's cry and there is the cry of every man. Okay. Now, the cry here means not necessarily a cry of anguish, the cry here could also mean the cry of the vendor, for instance, okay, the cries of commerce, right, of people engaged in commercial transactions, for instance. Okay. Now, he says that I hear the mind forged manacles, that is chains, manacles are chains that have been forged in the mind. Again another, another image connoting restraint, connoting constraint. Do you understand? Chartered, mind forged manacles. So, we are now sort of managing the text or reading the text, and our mind is managing it into putting it in in either side of the binary opposition. Then we have three figures, okay, very famous figures of the chimney sweeper. Chimney sweeper, then of the soldier, right, and of the youthful harlot. Okay. So, when we read this poem from a structuralist perspective, right, we can easily talk about another binary opposition, that is of the exploiter, okay, and the exploited. In this dyadic structure, we have the exploiter and the exploited. So, as we are reading what is happening, or how even the meaning of this poem emanates, is under this, who is exploited is the chimney sweeper, right, the chimney sweeper, and on the other hand the exploiter is shown here to be the church. Okay, the chimney sweeper at the time, these are very young boys who were sent up the chimney, to clean the chimneys, and they would often come down covered with soot, sometimes even even burnt, even sometimes the skins would be scorched. Okay. So, this was seen as an exploitation of these young boys. So, the chimney sweeper is the exploited figure here, and in the other hand we have the church. Then the next figure is that of the soldier, who Blake says, whose blood run, whose sigh runs in blood down palace walls. Okay. And on the other hand we have the palace. Okay. And the final figure is that of the youthful, the young harlot or prostitute. Okay. And on the other hand we may say the institution of marriage. This of course is a little problematic, right. There are critics and readers who would like to place the harlot on the other side of the binary opposition, okay, and saying that marriage here is a casualty. But if you look at the way Blake has written the poem, we can easily argue otherwise. Okay. For instance, when it talks about the chimney sweeper, looking at the logic of the architecture of the text, so it talks about the chimney sweeper. Then he talks about the church, that is the exploited. Okay. The next he talks about the soldier followed by the palace, and here the harlot followed by the marriage hearse, right. So, anyhow in this reading of the text, when we put the harlot on the other side, we find that there is another apart from the freedom and constraint or restraint or the lack of freedom dyad, we also have the exploited dyad. Okay. So, when we are reading this text, we are making sense of the text. Our mind is sort of chunking these according to our core structuralist mechanism in our mind, which is the binary opposition, okay, which cognitive psychologists would say who carry out work on children, that one of the first things cognitive operations in the mind of the baby, of the infant, is that of binary opposition. Okay. So, this is the way we would look. Now, by no means is this the only way. We have I have just pointed out to you only one tool of structuralist analysis, that is of the binary opposition or binary opposites in a text, and we have taken William Blake's famous poem London, where we find that we can at first reading we can easily sort of look at excuse me, easily look at or find out that there are two binary sets of binary oppositions. One is that of the freedom of the poetic persona who registers these things, okay, and on the other hand the lack of freedom in almost everything about London, be it its river Thames or its streets, its busy streets, right, and most of the populace, right. And then the second binary opposition we found was that of the exploiter and the exploited, which the poem structurally and in its architecture very clearly shows. Okay, it's really, I think, a majestic way, in a also a very neat way in which the poem has been structured. Okay, structurally it is, is an excellent poem, right. Finally, sort of exploding in the idea of the harlot's cry, doing two things: blasting its newborn infant's tear in the form of a curse, and sounding the death knell of the institution of marriage, right. So, this is one of the ways in which we can do structuralist criticism. There are many others. For instance, Roland Barthes also talks about certain codes, right. He talks about here the 5 codes which were identified by him in his again seminal work as said. He calls that a text, he says that a text may be read from the point of view of codes that are kind of signified by the text, these being for instance the symbolic, the semic, cultural, hermeneutic and the proeretic code. Okay. So, therefore, to summarize, structuralists would look at genre, okay, look at conventions. Remember, where did we find the word convention? We found the word convention when we talked early on about Saussure saying that language is a system of conventions to which we surrender, right. So, the conventions of a particular literary genre, the network of intertextual connections, okay, inside a text, the model of an underlying universal narrative structure, the recurrent patterns or motives, for instance, the recurrent pattern of exploit or exploited that we saw in the poem London. So, the next lecture would be on structuralism, and I am quickly giving a preview here in the sense that when you talk about structuralism versus post-structuralism, right, we see that a structuralist critic would seek parallels and echoes in the text as a system. It would look at structures, it would look at binary opposites, seminal binary opposites of the text and on intertextuality, while the post-structuralist critic would move beyond that and search for contradictions in the text, and how, as was famously said, how a text fails itself, right. Look for contradictions, paradoxes, shifts, absences, disunity and really the impossibility of meaning. So, while the structuralists say that meaning is possible, and then that the possibility of meaning is because of the underlying structures of the text, okay, because of the system of relations where words that are signs in that system in a text, right, get on their meaning in relation to one another, not in relation. If you look at the poem London again, you will find that the poem is a system of relations in which the word chartered is not simply that we understand the term chartered by its dictionary meaning, but also in relation to all things that are chartered. So, quickly if you get a question, for instance, like how is structuralism watershed compared to other kinds of more conventional ways of looking at a literary text, then you would say that structuralism, the structuralist approach to literary criticism is definitely a radical departure from other ways of looking at a text, from older ways of looking at a text, in the sense that it sees a literary text in terms of a system of relations, right. It sees meaning in a text as emanating from relations of the words that are units in the text, okay, in relation to other words in the text. It sees the cumulative coming out of the meaning of a text depending on structures like the binary structures and certain codes, as Roland Barthes had said, okay, and on how words get their resonances from other words, okay. Not only within the text, but also as intertextualist critics would say, how they in a larger, and if you look at if you kind of expand the model and look at certain texts as nodes, and how each text within a particular genre, okay, would take off from the other, where there are echoes of previous texts. So, intertextuality is also part of the structuralist enterprise at times, okay, though it does stand alone as a way of doing literary criticism. So, let us stop here today, and again, as I say, the many ways in which we could have done this, but this being a very basic level lecture. So, thank you for being with me in this lecture, and in the next lecture we are going to look at post-structuralism, particularly at deconstruction. Thank you.